Welcome to Hell of a Picture, a movie podcast where we discuss the most unforgettable films or movies of all time and what makes them unforgettable. I am Andrew Bartlett, and I'm sitting across the internet, as I do every week, from David Hollingshurst. How are you this week?
Doing very well. I'm trying to weather a heat wave here in Southern Ontario. So, gonna try to lay low and talk about some movies. It's a perfectly good excuse to stay inside and watch movies when I should be outdoors playing. But I am ready. I'm ready to playing. Gret it on, if you will. We're going to gret it on.
Yeah, so this week... I
thought about maybe saying, I thought about wig out, but, you know, I could only go with one, and I thought maybe gret it on was the choice. I'll have to live with that now.
Well, maybe you can use wig out in a later podcast. But this week we're using.
They've heard it now. It's over.
It's over. It's done.
Yeah, it has to be a first time thing. It doesn't have staying power.
I don't think so. We have our second Greta Gerwig film this week. We did the amazing Barbie last week, which we deemed a hell of a picture. And this week we're getting into Greta Gerwig's adaptation of Little Women. David, as we do every week, we start the podcast off with the rundown, not to be confused with Dwayne "The Rock" Johnson's, 2008 film, The Rundown. Is it 2008?
Classic. I think also starring alongside Sean William Scott, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah, 2003. 5 years off. Took a
very good year.
Yeah, Christopher Walken, Zero Dawson. Man, that's like one of his first ones. But this is not. Maybe we'll do the rundown. I don't know. But this is the hell of a podcast, hell of a picture rundown for Little Women.
Yeah, no, I think it behooves us to do the rundown at some point. We're going to have
rundown
to go
of the
a
rundown.
lot of the filmography of Dwayne "The Rock" the Cod, the Tooth Fairy Johnson. But for the moment, let us contend with Little Women. So the rundown, as mentioned. So Little Women is the story of the March family, specifically the March sisters, Joe, Amy, Meg, and Beth. The film is set in Massachusetts around the 1860s and chronicles the coming of age of the four sisters as they struggle with ideas of wealth and poverty, love and marriage and career, and the constraints society puts on women where all of these things are concerned. We watch in nonlinear fashion in this retelling of the tale as the girls become women and their lives take them all to very different places with the occasional influence of their mother, their aunt, and their neighbors, the Lawrences. Little Women is, of course, based on the novel of the same name by Louisa May Alcott. It was directed and written for screen by our girl, Greta Gerwig. It stars the unpronounceable and yet unbelievable Saoirse Ronan. Excuse me, I apologize. It's almost trite now to mispronounce that, but it is kind of tricky. Yes, it stars Saoirse Ronan, Florence Pugh, Emma Watson, and Eliza Scanlon as the March sisters, Laura Dern and Meryl Streep as their mother and aunt, respectively, and Timothy Chalamet as their neighbor, friend, and eventual husband, Teddy Lawrence. It had a budget of $40 million. It returned about $206 million and was nominated for a host of awards, too. 6 Oscar noms. The film was nominated for Best Picture, Best Supporting Actress for Florence Pugh, Best Adapted Screenplay, Best Original Score, and Best Costume Design, winning only for this last one, and well-deserved, I would think, though. It does seem that the best costume design always sort of tends to lean period piece. Do you find it's sort of like, okay, you've put on a lot of sort of frilly stuff. There's a lot of corsets and things like that. Here you go. Here's your Oscar. As you can imagine, the critical response and the audience response was quite positive. If you do scour the message boards, there is some contention over what is the greatest adaptation of this work. The 94 seems to be the running favorite, but it's far from a closed debate. So maybe something we'll touch on during our conversation. But the 1994 version starring Winona Ryder, among others, I do remember seeing growing up because, like you, I am the brother of a sister. So I was probably subjected to a version of this at multiple points through my childhood, and that is your rundown.
Yeah. There was how many, I mean, in the research, there's at least 7 adaptations of this.
At least 7 that the Google would confirm over the past 106 years. And we actually had a little conversation before coming on air as to what the most adapted work was, or the thing that had been put to film the most times. And we saw some staggering numbers. 7 it seems like a lot, but when compared to its peers, it's really not. Like the Christmas Carol was way up there. Dracula, though it's sort of muddy as to how they qualify these things. Maybe if just anything contains Dracula, then it sort of fits the bill. But this has been adapted a fair few times, and I want to get right into this. And I mentioned that you and I, being the brothers or sisters,
sure,
we probably were forced to watch this at various times in our childhood. Not just for having sisters, but I mean, I don't know about you, but there was a pretty big period in my childhood where I only had 2 channels at home. You had CBC and NTV. You had 3 and 5.
5 and 3.
So if the Sunday movie, if the Sunday movie on Channel 3 was Little Women, you were watching Little Women. You better believe that. So I have seen adaptations of this, of course, as I know you have. But this is not a kind of movie that I would normally just sort of choose to watch. And one of the reasons we were both excited to do this podcast, and I think we've mentioned this on air before, was that it would force us to watch movies that we otherwise wouldn't.
Yes.
And this is definitely one of those movies. If I'm scrolling through Netflix, it's very rare the kind of mood that will incite me to stop on Little Women. And, I have a type for sure, and I think it tends to be more action-centric. I'm probably not as interested as I should be in what I will uncharitably call mundane kind of happenings. But that's sort of what we get here. On paper, there's not a ton happening. You've got some women, they're little, one of them writes, one of them paints, one gets sick, a couple get married, and that's basically your picture, in sum. And when you stack that up with the other films we've done, it almost sounds kind of insipid. It's sort of like, what am I watching here? The largely domestic troubles of people in one of the least romantic periods and places in which to set a film. But what Massachusetts this teaches us, Massachusetts in the 1860s. Yeah. If you had a time machine, where would you be going? It's the height of the Roman Empire. It is not, I think it's safe to say. I don't think I'm ruffling a whole lot of petticoats by saying that.
Fair enough.
But what it can teach us, what it shows us is that in the hands of skilled writers and filmmakers, simple things can be very powerful. And I was very taken with this story and this version of it. And I cared intensely for the characters and what happened to them.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm glad we're going through this exercise because I'm really glad I watched this. I found it really rewarding. And I know I always do. As resistant as I am going into it, when I watch movies like this, I always come out the other side and be like, man, I'm glad I watched that. So to you, would you have watched this movie if you didn't have to? Or have you already, I guess is a more important first question.
Well, to touch on the first point you made about your sister, like I feel like as younger brothers to older sisters, sometimes we get subjected to these, I don't want to say these type of movies, but things that would interest our siblings, that we don't really have a say in. But interesting enough, Little Women was never really. I've never seen another adaptation. I never saw the '94 one.
Oh, really?
The big one in our house was my sister loved Romeo and Juliet, the adaptation with DiCaprio. So I was subjected to that. I was about to say
the Leo one, yeah. Okay.
The Leo one early on. That was like we're getting the soundtrack. We have the VHS. We're watching it on repeat, and man, that still holds up. That's a great adaptation.
It's been a long time since I've seen that. I would like to watch that again. That's an interesting idea.
That might be one we can lean into as well. Maybe some Shakespearean adaptations.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah. But with Little Women, I had never seen the '94 version, and when this first came out, I was interested because I'm always sort of aware of the Oscar buzz and nominations, and though I don't always see all the movies, like Barbie last week, I knew it was going to be great, and I just never sort of got around to seeing it. This was one that I was sort of interested in because I was a fan of Greta Gerwig's. That when I saw Lady Bird, which was kind of the movie she made before this, and I was a fan of that, and I said, she's an interesting writer and filmmaker. And when I sort of the Oscar nominations came out for it, I was like, man, this got like 6 Oscar noms, like Best Picture, like leading actress, supporting actress. I was like, man, this has to be like a decent movie. Not that the Oscars are the only source of, obviously, we've discussed that in the past.
They don't always get it right. I think we
Absolutely
talked about Green Book last week.
So I was intrigued, and I remember watching it, a few years ago, back sort of when it was first nominated. And I was like very impressed with it, and I like loved it. And you sort of go in with this bias of, yeah, this story isn't for me. This is an adaptation. It's been done before. And, like I probably am going to enjoy this, but like, maybe, but I don't know. And at that point, Greta Gerwig hadn't, I guess, it's not like she's made a ton of films, but like, was it sort of a one-hit wonder with Lady Bird, which was nominated for like Best Picture. And she had done one before, which I actually have never seen, a film called like, what is it? Nights and Weekends was her first sort of like independent film. But anyway, I sort of went in with low expectations, I guess, just sort of like, it's going to be, like you said, period pieces that aren't, that are sort of like, I don't want to say long and dragged out or whatever, but didn't really pique my interest. But like I said, after I saw it, I was sort of very impressed by a whole slew of aspects of the film, which we'll get into. So for me, it was more of a sense of, and I was happy to revisit it for this podcast. And when I did, I felt stronger about it the second time, I think. When watching it this past week, I was, and I don't know if that has to do with, Barbie or whatever, but I thought it was quite rewarding. And like, do you feel that because it's sort of a female story, that that you have any sort of like predisposition for it or idea?
Probably,
of what it could be?
probably. And I feel like that's a bias that I need to sort of work on correcting. But yeah, there definitely is this idea, I don't want to say it's entirely because it's a female story, and I'm not just trying to absolve myself there, but I feel like this movie told, even from the male perspective, I'm probably hesitant to watch just because of when it's set, what it's likely about, the magnitude of the events. There's a lot of, it's sort of dated. It's very everyday. It's very, very plausible, very real kind of scenarios that we're dealing with here. It's not Interstellar. It's not Jurassic Park. And, this is sort of a fault maybe of us in our generation that we do sort of compare, things that shouldn't be compared are being compared. You're stacking up movies to watch, and you're just sort of like, am I going to watch this story about genetically engineered dinosaurs, or am I going to watch a story about women struggling with, the dueling concepts of career and marriage? And there's one of those that's going to usually win out for me. But it's the one thing I did kind of enjoy is a change of pace, and this is sort of a deviation. But watching a period piece that didn't require everyone to speak in English accents, I found that kind of refreshing. And look, this is no beef. I love the English. I am of English ancestry, but it kind of seems like every situation in film or television where someone is not, modern day North American, they have to have a British accent.
Right.
Like in basically all fantasy and science fiction, or even just older movies where they couldn't get Russians to play the Russians, during the Cold War and stuff like that. Like they they would just get a British person, and it's sort of like, okay, they have an accent, so it's different. It's a different place. It's a different, like Game of Thrones. Like, there's no reason why they had to all be English. It's a fictional realm. It's not England, and the author's American. But I guess it helps with world building, or I don't know. It's kind of a it's kind of a weird choice and a weird deviation. I apologize there, but I know I said earlier that this is like the least romantic period that you could possibly find, and I was only partly joking. But this is a very close version of the past. We can still touch this in places. The houses, the furniture. It's not so different with some of the things that we grew up with. Like the house that I grew up in was 100 years old in the 90s. Yeah. So a lot of the aesthetics of this movie are not totally bygone. And the significance of that, I think, is that it helped me feel how close we are to the experiences of the people, and specifically the women in this era. We're not that far removed from a woman's utility being limited to marriage and domestic life.
Yes.
And marriage in this time, in this movie, they talk about it as a strategic economic proposition. And it's touched on a lot in this story. And there's this pervasive notion of the influence of money in their lives, especially on their autonomy. And I brought up money as a thematic element a lot in this pod so far. And I'm just wondering, like, am I imposing this on the films that we're watching, or do you think that this is strongly represented here and an important aspect of the movie?
Oh, this is without a doubt an important aspect of this film, because that's sort of what the crux of the struggles that these women are going through. It's like choosing, I want to say, career or marriage is such is sort of, I feel, what the film is sort of all about. But then, like, the idea that marriage is sort of a business transaction, and there's a great line that's, I think Amy says it in the movie, the Florence Pugh, when she's sort of, for lack of a better word, throws herself at Laurie, and she's sort of like, is like, I've loved you. And she says this line, then she says, no, I believe it. Maybe it's after where he sort of says, well, he's saying, like, don't marry Freddie or whatever, the guy that she sort of, and she's like, well, I'm not going to be a painter. I'm not going to be an artist that I want to do. I'm going to marry for money because I have to take care of my family or whatever. And she says that sort of, I might as well do it, like, have my own choice in it, and that's sort of like this tragic idea. Right. And that's, I guess, what Greta Gerwig really wanted to bring to the forefront. I feel like in the past, from what I've read, the past adaptations, and even in the book, the Amy character isn't, Amy, not Beth. Beth is the Scarlet Fever one. Amy, correct, Amy's character, Greta Gerwig, really sort of makes her a sympathetic character, which I don't feel like she is in the prior adaptations. She's much more sympathetic, I think, in this, even though she does things that we feel are like, burning the manuscript, obviously. And kind of like in our, as the audience, our head, stealing Laurie away from our hero, Joe. And the really great thing, I think, is like, we sort of empathize with her. And with the Joe character, this is something that I feel like is really, really brought to a head. Like, when towards the end of the film, when it's like she's given the autonomy, she's the one deciding not to go, like, with Laurie. She is, she comes out, she changes her mind or whatever. But the idea, it's like, she doesn't love him, and she doesn't love him the way that Amy does. It's like, it's her choice. But again, but getting back to the Amy character, it's like she steals, like, Laurie in how it's presented in the book. She's burns the manuscripts as kids. She steals her place, Joe's place, with Aunt March. right?
On the trip to Europe, yeah.
On the trip to the
Mm-hmm.
Europe. And it's there that she gets the sense of money, right? We have those scenes where Aunt March is kind of talking to her, is like, you have to marry for money. And it's like, she's like, kind of questions her and says, well, you didn't. She's like, yes, but I'm rich.
Yeah. Yes.
And like,
just like that too. Yeah.
she does. Meryl Streep.
Fabulous. Oh, yeah, no.
Like, I mean, sidebar, Meryl Streep. I mean, come on. Like, she isn't she
Legend.
She's the best. She just takes over. She, you know, we talked a little bit about during Oppenheimer how, you know, these characters that show up and you're like, what the hell is this person doing? But, you know, Meryl Streep is Meryl Streep, but like somehow you get lost in her performances all the time, I feel. Like.
Oh, absolutely.
Did you
have you watched
the
Only Murders in the Building?
No, I haven't, and I heard she's incredible.
Okay, because she shows up in that, and she plays a totally like kind of like I mean, now I haven't seen the entire filmography of Meryl Streep, obviously, but it seemed like it seemed a very atypical character for her, and she does it masterfully. It was just it was a real testament to her chops as an actor. Bravo to Meryl Streep, which she needs from us. You know, we need to be the ones to come out here and endorse Meryl Streep because the world is not doing it. Clearly, she's not getting flowers.
You've heard it here first. Hella Picture endorses Meryl Streep.
We are pro Streep. We're going to say that. We're going to take the courage to say that.
Yeah, I'm curious if you think like, so you have all these sort of ideas of marriage in the film, and like specifically with the three older, you know, Beth aside, because obviously Beth gets ex-nayed, but
yeah, tough wedding if you're dying of scarlet fever.
You have like you have Amy, who's kind of
dark affair.
You have them like marrying for you know, it's like money or companionship or love or just to sort of like you know, like necessity. Like, how do you think all the sisters in all their choices about marriage are presented? What do you think?
Yeah, I mean, that's important. That's really important that you brought that up, because there's sort of this kind of idea on, and I want to be delicate when I use the term feminism, because I don't fully understand what that term means. I think it means different things to different people.
Sure.
So I don't want to make declarative statements on what feminism is, but in sort of discussions surrounding that, you do get this idea that there are people who believe that feminism involves a rejection of certain expectations.
Right.
You sort of have to do things differently than the norm, than the prescribed sort of path of traditionalists.
Right.
But I think the movie, and I don't know about the book, but the movie, it takes time to show that there's nothing wrong with either path, that both can be good if it is your choice. You know, you look at Joe and Meg, and Joe, of course, has this ambition to be a writer. She's going to buck tradition. She's not going to marry, or so she says early on. She's very, very, very steadfast in that position. And Meg, the Emma Watson character, who Joe feels, you know, she should pursue her acting. She should do this. Well, Meg wants to get married. She wants a family, and she wants to have a home, and she wants these things that are sort of required of her, but she doesn't want them because they're required of her. She genuinely wants that.
Yes.
And that's fine. That is okay. And even Joe comes out at another point in the movie and says, you know, I don't want to be constrained by marriage. I don't want to be tied down, but I'm also lonely. I do want love. You know, she wants it. She wants it all. And again, there's nothing wrong with either one so long as the choice is yours. So I think a lot of it comes down to autonomy, you know, and there is this idea, just getting back to the money concept, that money creates autonomy. The Meryl Streep character, as you said in your beautiful delivery, in perfect period Streep, that she didn't have to marry because she had the money to do so. And, you know, that is sort of the point here, you know, that you are liberated to a degree by money. And we do see that in other ways in the movie too. There is sort of this juxtaposition of standing in society. You know, you see the extreme poverty of the Hummels, the family that the marches help out. And then the marches themselves sort of fluctuate between classes. You know, they're always sort of middle class, but in parts they're upper middle class. You can see they've got quite a bounty on the table, and the house is very decorative. And then you get to the point where there's sort of this like genteel kind of poor. They still own the house, and they're not totally destitute, but you can see that they have fallen on hard times for sure. And you know, I found that, and this is sort of a critique that I came upon when doing some reading for this, that there is this sort of critique of the original work and of the adaptations where charity is concerned. And there's sort of this idea that charity is good unless you're the one receiving charity. So it is good and noble to give to other people. And that is a big theme, a big message of the book. But there's also this idea that you shouldn't accept it unless you're absolutely out of options. There's sort of this pull yourself up by the bootstraps kind of mentality.
Well, that's what Jo is represented, how she's represented too. Right?
Yeah, for sure. And, you know, looking at it though, like, you know, we know now, or at least, you know, it's certainly in a modern sociological, world, there is this impossibility of working yourself out of poverty without help from either the system or from others and stuff like that. And this was written at a time when there probably would have been a more meritocratic, optimistic view of capitalism. I thought this movie did a better job of steering away. I didn't pick up a lot in the movie that they were saying you shouldn't accept help, because I thought actually what was very, very pronounced was that it was helping people that was both good for both parties. You know, that the charity helped everybody, and kindness was a powerful thing for both people involved in the transaction. Like, do you think that was something that Gerwig sort of course corrected on very specifically and put, you know, a kind of a modern view on that theme? I don't know.
I think even more
things there.
No, I think even more so than charity, it's the transaction of like, it's like a power dynamic, right? The first scene in the film is Jo going to meet with the publisher, or the I guess he's the editor of a paper, right? And she's selling her book. So in a sense, she relies on him. She relies on this transaction. Like, she's aware of this. She needs the transaction to help with her, to provide for her family. And she sort of says that. I sort of love the idea, just in like, you know, a sidebar. I kind of, you don't really get it on the first view, and you're like, oh, this is Jo, but it's like, it's really, you know, Alcott, the author, like Jo, the Saoirse Ronan is playing Alcott and playing Jo Marsh, right? In those moments, right? And like, she sees a pressing of the book at the end, and the pressing is, it's says Louisa May Alcott, right? I believe so. I think
it does. Yeah, it does.
Yeah. So it's like,
is that almost like a breakdown of the fourth wall? Is that like, you know what I mean? Like, are they sort of?
That's what I'm sort of
is
thinking.
Is that how it's supposed to go?
Yeah.
Or are they sort of transcending things there?
I think at the end, when the transaction is sort of reversed and the power dynamic changes, right? When you're talking about these transactions, and if it's, you know, the idea of capitalism, like, she holds the power, and she sort of he says, it's the whole copyright scene, right? And you're sort of tied up with it being Jo Marsh, but like, that's, again, this is sort of, for Alcott, this story that she wrote was very autobiographical, right? Like, she pulled on everything. It's like her own ideas. It's not unsimilar to the Fabelmans sort of thing, right? Now, granted, Spielberg didn't write the book, but he made the movie sort of loosely based. Alcott wrote this book loosely based on her life. She pulled all these sort of ideas. She is the Jo Marsh of this story, right? And
Yeah.
when we get that transaction at the end, and there's that power dynamic, which I think is so important, where she kind of like, the guy tries to take advantage of her, right? And say, well, I'll give you the money up front, but I want the copyright. And that is how Alcott was able to provide for her family for years and like do everything that she did in her life after she wrote this book, because she owned the copyright to it. So, there is this idea of, that is a modern look at it, but that is actually what happened, right? Except, when you look at like the 94 version of this movie, or like the movie sort of ends with her marrying, and the book ends like this, it's like you said, it's sort of that breaking of the fourth wall. It's like she marries the German, or the European professor, who in the book is like apparently like, wait. Sounds Dutch.
I think he was actually Italian, but yeah. But
is he Italian? In the book, he's German.
I think so. Is he? Oh, okay, maybe it was German. I don't know. It's just he sort of. I
thought he was
Italian,
French anyways, or maybe he's Italian.
We're very worldly, as everyone can tell.
But yeah, like apparently in the book, he is like an older professor, and like one thing Gerwig
handsomed him up for the movie.
Yeah, but the prior adaptations, I think they make him younger and more appealing. Oh, thumbs up. Younger and more appealing. And for people not watching,
the internet really
I just
likes
got
the younger version. Yeah.
We like the thumbs. We get thumbs up on our on the video version of this for when you make thumbs up. So anyway.
whenever there's a hunkier version of a character in the film versus the book, we get a thumbs up. So good job on that.
Yeah, but I guess my point is just that like the ending is so interesting. I want to kind of talk about that and with the ending in the book, she ends up marrying. It's the same as the movie, except there's this aspect of the Alcott / Joe character who are sort of tied into one, and she's she's Gerwig is said when she first met with the producers to do a draft, she's like, well, I don't want to have her marry the professor at the end. She's like, no. Well, and the producer was sort of like, well, you gotta kind of have that. It's like, that actually happened. And she's like, well, no, like that's the idea of the ending for Gerwig is like we were talking about earlier. It's the autonomy. It's Jo Marsh having her choice. It's about her choosing. And it's like, but like, she breaks that fourth wall. She puts her in that conversation with the publisher, and he's like, well, you gotta do that. It's like, that's what people want. And it was like, even going back to she's taking a lead from Alcott back from when with the book written. People read this book at the time and they said, well, obviously we want her to end up with Laurie. And even watching the movie, I sort of forgot upon rewatching. I was like, does she end up with Laurie? I can't remember. And I'm like, when it's not happening, you're like, oh, like I want her to end up with like Laurie. Like I felt myself saying that. What? She's not ending up with Timothée Chalamet. Anyway, she's like,
oh, man.
That's not what.
I can't help but root for Timothée Chalamet. I mean,
man, I love Chalamet.
It's irresistible. Big fan of the show.
She gets the choice, and that's the most important thing. Is like she has she gets to choose what she does with her book. And there it
does sort of seem like she's compromising, though. You know what I mean? Because there is that moment where it's like she's telling the story, you're seeing it sort of move forward, and then there's sort of this stop and this rewind and course correction, where it's like, okay, she gets married. You know what I mean? And it's sort of, she's making that concession to the publisher there, which I guess is sort of representative of Gerwig's concession to the producers.
Exactly. Absolutely.
And I mean, did that sort of work for you? I felt that took me out of it a little bit. I didn't really love that as a device in the story. I thought it kind of was an odd departure towards the end of the movie that sort of, yeah, it took me out of what the flow of things. Did you agree?
I feel like it works. It worked for me because it was a nonlinear storytelling. That's what we sort of talked about, right? The original book sort of is told in two parts, the childhood and the adulthood, right? And in the story, Gerwig decides to sort of interweave them. When it's sort of first happening, I'm like, this is a bit confusing because, say something like Oppenheimer, which we talked about a couple weeks back, and Oppenheimer, he uses the very strong device of black and white, right? When what time period you're in with the black and white, when you're in color, and it's very sort of distinct versus like when this weaves in with the characters kind of very subtly. You're like, wait, this is the past. This is like them as young girls. Yeah. This isn't so I found myself as the movie kind of progressed, it's almost like she eased us into that style of storytelling as it was going. And the interesting part was as I was going forward, the very distinct moment when Beth passes away and dies. And she does essentially what you're saying is like this reshooting of a scene, right? At the very end, doesn't quite work for you because she kind of like restarts the scene and she's like, no, she goes and she gets the guy. She retells that scene of coming downstairs as kids, and it's these warm tones. The color palette is bright and it's like childhood. She comes home. It's like, oh, the sun is coming in. There's these reds and everything's sort of alive. And she sees that Beth is okay, right? And she's rebounded. She's like, oh my God, amazing. And then immediately she shoots the same scene. And it's like her adulthood, the tones are dark, like green and like blues. And and she comes down and she realizes that Beth has died. And it's this very distinct moment in the film where it's like the warmness, fondness that we think about in childhood versus sort of the realities of adulthood and the life that actually happens when you become an adult. And that I feel like is a lot of what the film is sort of saying. So, to your point, the ending, I'm sort of warmed up to it at that point of that kind of style. And like, okay, she's going to retell this part. Which I think is okay, I think it works.
Yeah, I thought it was very abrupt, though, versus what you were talking about with Beth and stuff like that. I thought that was handled a little more, it was a little more nuanced. I thought the ending part just felt it was almost like, I don't know if I can come up with an appropriate analog, but just the way she was also narrating it made it seem, it sort of took me out of things. Like, yes, we have nonlinear storytelling throughout, but it's almost like she's saying, okay, rewind. And like, it's almost like we had and that kind of effect really sort of took me out. It felt a little atypical and a little incongruous with the rest of the film. And admittedly, I got lost at a couple of points temporarily throughout this because I didn't think the physical cues in terms of the time period were as strong as they were in other movies that we've seen this style of storytelling. Like in Following, we talked about the physical changes in the lead character in that were very clear and very very pointed. You could pick up on where you were, even if you were still sort of in the dark, which was part of the mystery of that. But yeah, I felt a little more lost at points in this. It wasn't enough to overwhelm my experience, but I did see it as maybe something that could be improved in the movie. Just a few points. It wasn't glaring or anything like that.
To just for me, I think aside from that Beth, the death scene, the moment when
that was where it was most pronounced. You're 100% right there.
But I think there's I got
confused there.
There's a moment of, because this, I think what she's really trying to, get across, not so much is that there's like, there is like childhood, there's adulthood, and it's like, but the movie is really sort of, like you said, it's a coming of age story. And there's sort of like, I feel like the reason she's doing this is like, okay, maybe she could have she used black and white for all the kid stuff, or all the color stuff, or the modern stuff. She, all was all black and white. Like, how different would we feel about the film? Or like there were just, stronger elements that made us very obviously distinct that this is the adulthood, this is the childhood. I feel like the reason she doesn't do that is like there are, I guess, moments of that bring us back to our childhood and as adults, and then also moments in our childhood that sort of like make us sort of have to be grown-ups. And like this is obviously very much in a sense of like, I'm thinking about the scene of when they're kids and they're trying to get money, and they get the word that the dad is sick and the mom has to go, so Joe cuts her hair, and it's like she has to make
your
this,
one
like,
true beauty.
Yeah,
I love that line. Oh no, you're one true beauty. It's so
and then
great.
she's, but then it's like she's making these adult choices, and then the next moment she's crying on the stairs and comes out. She's like, you're so sad about Dad?" And she's like, "It's my hair." And it's like amazing. Like it's like you're still like a kid, right? But there's this kind of mending, or this kind of weaving in and out of childhood, adulthood that is not just part of the story, but part of how she films it. But I think that like this one moment between and I was talking about the color tones, and it's like the lightness of a childhood, that brightness, and sort of this like dull kind of more reality, like more real, I guess, tones in the adulthood. Was like the scene with Laurie. It's like the wedding scene, and Laurie sort of like throws himself at Joe and says, like, "I love you from the moment I laid eyes on you. Like, be with me," essentially. And it's like it's a sunset, and it's like so well shot. It's in this field. There's this child aspect to it of like, free, and you're like running free, but then the sunset is setting on their childhood, because she makes this like grown-up decision to be like, no, I'm not, I could, but like that's not what I want. I don't want to be with you. I don't love you. And that sort of is when the film, I feel like, switches. And really becomes this like, even though the film is still told non-linearly, the tone kind of switches at that point, for me anyway.
Yeah, and I mean, I think there's something too, like the weaving in and out of time frames. It's almost sort of, it's an articulation of memory. We tend not to remember things in this really cohesive chronological way. And we talked about this with the art of storytelling and following. This is how you tell a story a lot of the times to people. It is a little disjointed. It's not necessarily totally linear. And there is these blurring of lines in between things. And you talked about the framing and the lighting and stuff like that. And one of the things that I noticed, there were a few shots in this movie that felt like portraits. They were framed in such a way with everything that was very reminiscent of something that Amy would paint.
Yes.
And I thought there was a lot of really beautifully orchestrated shots. I think the wedding scene is one. There's another one where I believe the Emma Watson character is going away. She's sort of being presented to society. Remember, she goes off to that sort of like girls' boarding house almost, where they can all sort of be debutantes and meet nice boys. And there's a departing scene where, it's framed like something you would see in a gallery. It was really quite beautiful, and I thought Gerwig did a really nice job of just incorporating moments in there like that. I thought that was beautiful.
To jump on that, like I love the idea just of like art in general in the film. And, the four sisters are essentially all artists in their own way. You have a musician, you have an actor, you have a writer, you have a painter, and they're all sort of trying to weave in and out of how to discover their art, how to, display their art, how to convey their art. And I think I love
how to balance it too. You know what I mean?
Yeah. I love how Joe is like, they have the line where she is talking to the professor and he's sort of critiquing it. And it's like Shakespeare brings up Shakespeare. And Shakespeare was one of the greatest poets who ever lived because he smuggled his poetry into popular works, which is an amazing line.
Mm-hmm.
And, but there's this, I read this review from Richard Brody of the New Yorker who said, you know, Joe's idea of art and creating art. And it's like it's the contrasting ideas of making a good living from one's art and relying on that art as a mode of personal expression. Like that's sort of her struggle, right? She's sort of selling out and she has all these stories that she doesn't really connect with. That's why she burns all.
No, she doesn't believe in her work at first.
She doesn't really believe in it.
That's what the professor identifies. Like he's not saying you are bad. He's not saying you're not talented. He's saying that what you're doing is not something that you believe in, and he can pick up on that by reading it.
Which is almost so interesting about the Amy character when she kind of goes and is doing her own art, and they have that scene where she's doing the portrait, and she looks over and sees somebody else doing the same portrait, and it's like, I don't know if you got this in this moment, but like hers is like infinitely better than the other one. Like how she is, and she is such a good artist, and she gets like complimented. But for her, she's already where Joe aspires to be. Like she already knows, but it's never good enough for her, like sort of thing. Like Joe even says early on when she's fighting, she's like, everybody tells me my work is good. Like everybody tells me I'm a great story writer. Everybody tells me I'm wonderful. And he's sort of like, wow. And then whereas Amy, nobody really tells her that. And she's sort of like, it's never good enough for herself. And she makes the decision. She's like, I'd rather not make any sort of art than create something that's like middling, she says, or whatever, which is like so sad because she really feels like she is the one who is maybe the true artist. Not that Joe isn't, but that they're both true artists and they just sort of have different mindsets when it comes to it, which makes her like really a more tragic character.
Yeah, I mean, and it's interesting. There's a through line there that I found in Barbie that I saw here, and it's this idea that in order for a woman to be taken seriously, and you see this very acutely with Amy, she has to be extraordinary. It's not enough for her to be talented; she has to be a genius. Whereas a man in the same profession need only be talented and a man. You know what I mean? It's enough for them to just sort of be that. And, you know, Ken has that moment in Barbie when he's talking to the other Kens and he marvels at how a woman came up to him on the street and asked him for the time. And he's like, she respected me just by virtue of being a man. And, you know, meanwhile, the Barbies are president or their doctor or their astronaut Barbie. And Amy says it, you know, talent isn't genius. And there's this sense that she could never sell her work or she could never be taken seriously unless it's overwhelmingly and irrefutably genius. If it's just talented work, then she can be dismissed. And meanwhile, history is replete with guys who are just pretty good, you know, pretty good, but not necessarily geniuses, but they made livings and they supported themselves and maybe even had generational wealth as a result of it. You know what I mean? Or at least were able to do that, you know, do what they loved. And yeah, there is this great tragedy in Amy that she doesn't think she can do that. But again, she does find joy in something that, you know, maybe you could see as kind of a compromise or a cop-out. Yeah. But if the joy is no less real, then, you know, I don't know. There certainly is tragedy there, but there is also a happy ending to a degree. And yeah, I thought that was just sort of an interesting, you know, idea that I think Gerwig touches on in both movies. And like, we love talking about how our directors play with the same ideas in different ways across different films. I think, I look forward to sort of seeing more of what she finds interesting and what she wants to talk about it again and again. And I want to bring us into maybe a little earlier than we normally would, so we can have a little longer discussion about the idea of this being a hell of a picture. Yeah. And so I want to put to you, so here's what I struggle with. Like, when I ask myself if this is a hell of a picture, what I settled on was it's definitely a hell of a story.
Okay.
And having not read the book and having not seen all the adaptations, I wonder, can we say definitively this is the best version of this story? And I guess, does it need to be the best version of this story for it to be our consideration of the best, like, our a hell of a picture for us?
Right.
Like, and I mean, like, we've done other adaptations. In fact, most of the things, weirdly enough, that we've done are like Jaws, Jurassic Park, Oppenheimer. These are all adaptations of books, but they were the only adaptations of them. So it's a little different. And we talked about it earlier. We've seen, or history has now seen, 7 versions of this story put to movie.
Yes.
So do you think, to justifiably have this conversation, would we have to watch all of them? Would we have to read the book? Would we have, like, what is the work that we need to put into to make this decision? Can we, can like a iterative adaptation be added to this list? Can it be in the pantheon, or is it precluded because of that? What are your thoughts on that?
I think it can be. I think you can look at something like, I think the issue that you're struggling with this is not that how many there have been, because, I feel like people do adaptations of lots of different things, multiple takes, remakes, telling different renditions of stories. I think it's just the sheer importance of this story, of this, mostly this book. This was a book that's been around for what, 100 and how many years? 150 years almost? Like,
yeah, I guess so. Yeah. I mean, if it was written in the period in which it's set, then yeah.
Yeah. So, like, I feel like this is an important book, and it's important for women and girls of, throughout history. So it's like, at least knowing this sort of story, I think, is important. But for
again,
me,
are we applauding the story? Are we applauding the story, or are we applauding the movie? And is there a distinction that has to be made between the two?
well, when you think about this story, it's like, or this film, I think you can look at films and adaptations like in and of themselves. Like, I think,
Sure.
Does it work? I just think, like, something like this, it's such a huge story, or such a huge novel, that it's obviously inevitably going to be tied to, to the book. The movie is going to be tied to the book. I don't think we have, I think that's a different discussion. If you're saying, okay, is this a hell of a picture? What about the one in 94? Is 94 a hell of a picture? Or, or then are you comparing them? Like, I think comparing different renditions is different than deciding whether it's, for us anyway, a hell of a picture. I think
right, but
the strongest.
Do you think you could, like, in good conscience, say, like, yes, this is a hell of a picture, and so is the 1994? Like, do you think you could do that? Do you think that's justifiable? Or is there something that is? I mean, we haven't really written a constitution for this or anything, but if we are, can you have 2 of the same movie on here? Maybe you can. Maybe you should. I don't know.
That sort of feels like another question. I feel like, or another debate, I should say. Then you're getting sort of into remakes, and like remakes of stories, whether it's like a remake of a book or a novel, or just like a remake in general. Like, I feel like that's a debate for us to have maybe in another podcast. But the idea of, like, yeah, can an original piece of work for us be in a hell of a picture, but then the remake be a hell of a picture as well? That's kind of tough. That's like, because, like, again, is one better than the other? It's like, that's sort of what it boils down to. And then what makes it better? And
yeah,
it's
hard. And then is this, and
as
a piece of art? As a piece of art, is the movie as good as the book? You know what I mean? Like it.
Yeah.
Like, we at no point during our Jaws or our Jurassic Park episode did we really reference the novels, and both of those are novels. It was Peter Benchley wrote Jaws, Michael Crichton wrote Jurassic Park. They were both bestsellers. Right. That's why they got turned into movies. We never brought them up once.
Yeah.
And, most people may not even know that those are adaptations of novels. But I don't know if there's a way to escape, the knowledge that this is an adaptation of a novel. It seems pretty ubiquitous in terms of people knowing that. And even the movie itself concerns itself with the novel. And it's very much
Yes.
centered around that. And so I'm just wondering
I think it's more so based
if you
around as a novel versus the other films, the other adaptations. So I think it's like comparatively to the original work, right? What is the original work? The original work in this case is a novel. So it's like, can you,
Mhm.
like you said, understand or put this in the pantheon of Hell of a Picture if you feel differently about the novel or how you feel about the original work?
I think more what I'm saying is the movie is this a work of art the equal of the novel? Is like when you have
Culturally,
an eye for the
definitely not.
technical. You have an eye for the technical and for the craft. So like did you see a lot in this movie that when you stack it up against other things that we've looked at where you're like, yeah, this is really skillfully made? Or is it just a really good story with great acting and great writing, for sure, in terms of the screenplay, not the novel writing, but the screenplay writing? Full marks to her on that. But, are we just sort of seeing a fairly ordinary movie with a great story? You know what I mean? Like, am I saying this correctly? Am I getting that across? Like,
Yeah, I think you're like
so
sort of leaning into the technical aspect of it and like not
yeah, is there
necessarily
anything that
that it
makes it a
has.
great movie beyond the story? Beyond the story, is there greatness here?
I
Is
think
my question.
so. I think so, but
Yeah.
I don't think it's necessarily shot really great, but I think structurally, I really like kind of how, and we talked a lot about that nonlinear style. Like you said, the
Hmm.
performances are so good. Like
Fabulous.
even with the
Fabulous.
two nominations, the costume design. I know you mentioned it earlier, but the costume design here is 75. I think I read that there were 75 original costumes made, and each costume took 40 hours
Wow.
of so like think about that in a sense of like the costume design. So it's like I think
Yeah.
sometimes we can get bogged down with visually. There are visual kind of interesting things, like I said, the color tones and but like camera wise, um, the score seems to be pretty good, but it's like you said, I don't think they're
Yeah.
remarkable. So yeah,
Hmm.
I mean, you can kind of debate either way, sort of thing. But I think you hit the nail on the head. The strongest aspect of this film, I feel, is the story and the
But
writing.
you make a good point there that making a movie, sometimes I think we can all sort of look at filmmaking just from the directorial point of view, from the cinematography, but there is a huge amount of other things that go into making a movie, like the costume design, like the set design, like the score, like, there's a lot of these things. So if we're talking about, is this a great movie? Well, we need to consider all those things. And there's some very strong elements that you mentioned
Yeah.
there. So yeah, that's a really good point. And
All right. So
yeah,
in that case,
it's a tough one.
can you turn your key on this film, David? Can you make this a hell of a picture, or is it just a hell of a story for you?
I I don't think I can say hell of a picture. You know what? It's a great story. It is a fabulous story. It's really well made. It's really well made. Great performances. A lot of things to love in this. I could see myself watching this movie at Christmas time every year. You know what I
Yeah.
mean? This could be one of those movies that you watch routinely on an occasion.
Yeah.
Um, I don't think I'll go hell of a picture because again, I think there is something to the idea that have we seen a better version of this? Is the same story told better in another film? Was the '94 better? I think there's something to that discussion. I don't know. I will say no for now in terms of the hell of a picture. But I loved this. I really enjoyed watching it. I'm glad we did.
Okay. Well, for me, this I agree. I don't think it's a hell of a picture, but I think it's teetering on hell of a picture. I think it's pretty close.
Yeah.
But like you said, it's like, can a really great story and a really great way of telling that story be enough to make it hell of a picture? And like I said, there's nothing I didn't really not like about this film. Like you said, the performances are great, the costumes are great, the settings are great. But yeah, is it enough for me to make it a hell of a picture? It's like I don't think so. With sort of
Yeah, and I was
sort
like,
of
I
figuring
had some
out.
issues like with the ending, and there were like, again, like I said, I lost my place a couple of times in the jumping around chronologically.
Yeah, I think
And there's some
just
aspects of the
being
story that maybe don't translate super well to modernity. The whole, oh, I proposed to your sister and you know that, and now I'm going to marry you, and everyone's cool with that. Really?
yeah
Like, you know what I mean?
yeah
Like, is that super? I mean, maybe that is of its time, and maybe it was entirely plausible then. It
right
probably was, but and I don't see how you can go about correcting that now while still maintaining fidelity to the work, which is obviously very important. But yeah, that sort of comes across as like, really.
yeah
So a few things there, but great movie, really
great
enjoyed
movie and worth checking out. So
100%, yeah.
we both kind of, I don't want to say stumbled in this, but like Barbie led us to Little Women, and in keeping with this trilogy for our filmmakers, we did 3 Spielberg, 3 Nolan. We're going to finish with a 3rd Greta Gerwig film, and we're going to next week finish our Greta Gerwig trilogy with Lady Bird, which you have never seen.
I've not. I'm assuming it's about the wife of Lyndon Baines Johnson, former president. But don't correct me. I want to go in totally fresh and surprised.
Yeah, that's a good plan. I've seen this, saw it many years ago, like Little Women. I'm excited to revisit it, and she's back with Saoirse Ronan as the lead. And there's and then I'm going to there's a lot of running themes that kind of continued with Little Women and Barbie. So I'm excited to sort of like finish our Gerwig and kind of complete the trilogy and sort of see how all 3 of these sort of line up together. Very excited for Lady Bird next week. It'll be great.
Absolutely.
Okay. Any parting words with this film?
One thing I'll tack on here, we were remiss in our Oppenheimer episode. We had told you in past that we were always going to try to find the Seinfeld connection, and we failed you there. Noticed it watching the movie, didn't bring it up. Meant to bring it up when we did Barbie last week. Anyway, I'm finally bringing it up. In one of the Robert Downey Jr. Hearing scenes, one of these senators briefly passes a piece of paper to another, and in that coveted meaty role, you have none other than Bizarro Jerry himself, Kevin.
Kevin,
yeah, who hangs out at Reggie's, the Bizarro coffee shop, with Gene and Feldman, and their Bizarro Newman, Vargas, and all that. And man, what a great couple episodes that is! And
amazing.
Yeah, we dropped the ball there, but we're making up for it here. So
and we found the one today, right?
In.
You made the Dutch reference, right? That was
but I mean that was kind of a stretch. I mean there was no actual component to that. We just dropped a little Todd Gack in there. We did that last week too. Actually, we dropped in Todd Gack. I think
Todd Gack.
No, it was during Oppenheimer because the cinematographer had a totally unplaceable name, which which we eventually found out was Dutch.
Yeah, that sounds about right.
So who are the Dutch? What do you mean, where's Holland? It's a country next to Belgium. No, that's the Netherlands. Holland is the Netherlands.
Then who are the Dutch? Incredible. All right. Good. So, with all that being said, I'm glad we did Little Women, and I'm excited for Lady Bird next week. And
me too, buddy.
And so for David Hollingsworth, I'm Andrew Bartlett, and this has been Hell of a Picture.